to the Drexel Seymour Show, where we encourage you to rise up and take your position. Today, we are going to talk with Dr. Cory Williams, and the topic is more about COVID-19. And a lot of us perhaps thought by now, COVID-19 would have gone away, but it hasn't. And it's something that we need to talk about because it looks like it'll be around for a while. And there's a lot of misinformation about COVID-19. Some people see certain things, they just go and spread it. And we need to get to the depth of this conversation about COVID-19. We need to talk about the vaccine. And so I thought the best person to do this would be Dr. Cory. And I'm going to read Dr. Cory's bio. Okay, I know Dr. Cory really well. I met him many years ago through my friend Sabrina Moyes, who he's married to. But Dr. Cory is an experienced medical doctor, researcher, management consultant, and a biopharmaceutical business leader. He has deep experience in clinical research and medical practice, as well as business strategy and biopharmaceutical research and development, with a proven track record of leading global teams to deliver cutting-edge medical therapies, address unmet patient needs, and enable successful commercialization. He has worked in many therapy areas, including oncology, cardiovascular, metabolism, rare disease, and immunology. In numerous countries, in all phases of clinical development. He is a physician, scientist, strategic thinker, and innovator with broad general management and international experience, including China and Asia. He spent 10 years at Pfizer, where he was the vice president in global product development and led global research and development units, supporting clinical development, directed strategic planning for global functions, and managed enterprise-wide strategic initiatives. Cory and his wife Sabrina, who's from Grand Turk, they have 2 children, and of course have considered the Turks and Caicos Islands their home. As a family, they share time between Providenciales and the US. Cory began his career in hospital medicine at the Princess Margaret Hospital in Nassau, Bahamas. He earned his medical degree at the University of the West Indies in his home country, Jamaica. And he has a PhD from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. And before entering the industry, Dr. Cory pursued his science research on molecular mechanisms in cancer and oncology. He was an engagement manager at McKinsey & Company, where he consulted to Fortune 500 early stage and mid-sized companies before joining Pfizer. Cory has authored many peer-reviewed publications and has been invited to speak at scientific and business conferences. In addition to his passion for science and medicine, Cory is an avid sports enthusiastic, especially football, and dedicates time to family and community, including service on nonprofit boards. So I want to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Cory Williams to my show. Thank you for agreeing to come to this show.
Drex, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity. Most definitely.
Thank you. Did I leave out anything on your introduction?
You probably spoke too long.
There's a lot. You have a lot to there's a lot in your background. You have a lot to share. And you're a man with many hats. Wearing many hats. Yes. Well, today we want to talk about COVID-19. We want to talk about the vaccine. And I know that you worked for Pfizer for many years. Tell us about this COVID-19. How did this start?
It's a very interesting case, and while I didn't work on the vaccine at Pfizer myself because I had already left Pfizer by the time that COVID came around, to be frank, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19.
What is it called?
SARS-CoV-2.
SARS-CoV-2.
Serious autoimmune respiratory syndrome.
Okay.
That's the SARS, which actually harkens back to, you may recall, the SARS epidemic in the mid or early 2000s. That also started in Asia. I think the epicenter was Hong Kong back then.
Okay.
And the CoV-2 is coronavirus, a short of the family name of the virus.
Okay.
2, which is also important because it again harkens back to the original, when first discovered, that called SARS back in the early 2000s.
Okay.
So the same family of viruses indeed causes some similar conditions affecting the respiratory system. But clearly SARS-CoV-2 is a much more potent, virulent, and severe member of the family compared to what we saw back in the early 2000s. So that gives a little bit of the history. So to some degree, the family of viruses was known about and researched upon. Indeed, they had tried to bring forward vaccines back then. So there was already a good body of work done to understand the virus. But this is clearly a different one. So while you could take some lessons from that and build on that, this is clearly new.
Yeah, but it came from the same family though.
Same family. And here's the thing about the origins of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 that's interesting to understand. So it's what we call a zoonosis, and this is where an infectious agent or a microbe jumps from being in, let's say, other animals to humans. So that's why we use the term zoo.
Okay.
Kind of animals jumping over. It happens in many other conditions as well.
Yes.
Some more well known, some less so well known. From conditions that may affect, let's say, common field animals, and then jumps over to humans for farm animals, for example, right? This one is interesting because the thinking is it crossed over from animals in the South Asian continent, so southern parts of China, the ones that have been highly prioritized to where it came from, bats, caves, for example.
Yeah.
There is a rather unique and not well known animal for the rest of the world that dominates and is known in southern Asia called a pangolin. It has a small, almost armored looking shape, similar like an armadillo in South America, but it's larger.
Okay. So it's not related to the bat family?
No, unrelated to the bat family.
Okay.
Right. So that, and I think there have been a few others, but those are the two that I recall that were most associated with the beginning of COVID. And one theory is it's eating these animals, like the pangolin, led to the zoonosis, the transfer to humans, again eating, which is a similar condition to another zoonosis, Ebola, in Africa.
Yes.
Where eating essentially monkey meat or bush meat as they call it, caused that virus to jump, right? So it's a similar and well-known and well-characterized biological phenomenon. So that's kind of one, eating, right? And delicacies that occurs in many parts of the world, but known in Asia. That was one.
So, again, I'm listening to you. So basically, because people are saying that this COVID-19 was a setup.
Right.
But you're saying that it's really coming from animals to humans.
Indeed. And let me tell you a little bit more. We're perhaps hearing bits of the story could be misconstrued to think it's a setup. But if you understand the full story, perhaps you'll give it a different understanding.
Yes. And that's why I have you here, because
Sure.
I know you do a lot of research.
Indeed.
Indeed.
So, zoonosis jumping from animals to man, one category could be eating, especially delicacies. But these are animals that we don't normally eat. They're not farmed. They occur in the wild. So humans and our immune system, which protects us against foreign agents, would not have been prepared necessarily for that jump if you're eating. The other potential scenario where it could have jumped is with bats, where not necessarily that they were eating, but being in caves, for example, maybe being exposed to bat droppings, and you can imagine in caves, and I'll come to the reason caves were brought into that scenario. Enclosed, not good airflow, so a lot of the pollutants that would be in the cave, in the air, would be inhaled.
Wow.
From the bat droppings, for example, and other excrement from the bats.
Yes.
That were in this cave. Then you'd say, okay, caves, that's kind of rather bizarre. Why would that happen? But again, in southern China, but probably other parts of South Asia, miners would be in caves for industrial activities. And being in the cave, they could get exposed.
And I know you lived in China.
I did.
Yeah.
I did. Again, this happened after I was in China.
But you know
But I understand
Yes.
some of the dynamics.
Yes.
To your point. So those are two potential scenarios, and I think there are others as well that could explain the transition. So that's just one, the transition, because not just being exposed means necessarily it will jump over. However, jumping over and if exposed for long periods, so again, eating and eating repeatedly, for example, being in the caves, again, if these are cave workers and being there for long times, the immune system could be triggered and triggered and triggered, and potentially at some point there is a breakthrough where, again, the agent is so foreign that actually becomes an infection. But to do that, the virus needs to have gone through a number of rounds, so to speak, of infecting or trying to infect humans, and to kind of, quote unquote, perfect that transition for the virus. Because if you think about it from the virus's perspective, going into a new host, they need a host to live. So they're going to try their ever best to do, as a virus, what they can to survive in that new host. It's very similar to like antibiotics and microorganisms like bacteria developing resistance.
Yeah.
They mutate to be able to accommodate whatever you threw at them. In a similar fashion, they've entered humans, but again, the immune system tries, and there's a little bit of a battle, but over time and multiple rounds of infection, the virus actually mutates. To
and
infectious.
like you say, the immune system, this is foreign.
Indeed.
To the immune system.
Indeed.
You know, they're not used to this.
Indeed.
So you that's a very good point, you've made.
Exactly.
You know.
So that's the kind of part one.
Yeah.
The zoonosis, right? Jumps over. Now, from what we understand, going back as far as SARS in origin, and perhaps with other members of that family, there has been research and virology research going on in many centers worldwide that require a high level of protocol for these viruses and viral cell lines to be managed, because, as you can imagine, they can be highly potent. And if through an act of negligence or a mistake, if the researchers become in contact, they could themselves become infected. And as you work with these viral cell lines, that goes through multiple passages and multiple turns, which, going back to the previous example, let's say in the cave, multiple rounds of infection, the virus can actually mutate through those many passages to become at some point perhaps infected.
So it's not something that happens overnight.
It doesn't happen overnight, and could potentially not happen deliberately on the part of the researcher or the research platform. Doing the work, having the cell lines over time, different things can happen, you know. And I have no idea if this did occur and how it,
but it's possible.
It's possible that there could have been a breach in that protocol that would allow some infection. So again, not necessarily a setup. This is my impression from reading the literature. You know, there's still work to be done. I think WHO and other global agencies are still looking to the origins. But it's quite likely that zoonosis and or continued research and some act of negligence could have led to a leak, so to speak. And again, I don't necessarily think it was deliberate or planful, but could have been an act of negligence. So that's kind of one theory, which in and of itself is not necessarily separate from a zoonosis, because if there were zoonosis and they were researching on it, they could have cell lines, or it could be totally separate.
Yeah.
But we're still yet to understand the full origins, but I think those two theories
Yeah.
have a lot of merit.
Yeah.
To your question around, is this set up or planned?
Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
I mean, what you're saying. And what I like about you, you went to be very detailed about it. Because a lot of times, we hear things and we just run with it.
Mhm.
We didn't even think about it. But you have gone from the beginning stages to how we are now, which makes a lot of sense. And it could happen. And it has happened.
Indeed.
It has happened.
You're right.
So now that this is out there,
Mhm.
there is a concern. How do we get rid of it?
Mhm.
And so, what advice do you give to people? What is the best defense against contracting the COVID-19 virus?
Mhm. Good question, and again, based on where we are now. So we are now at least 2 years into this pandemic, because if you think
That
back,
is right. That's true.
October, November 2019,
That's
in
right.
Wuhan and China, there are cases.
It is 2 years.
Yeah, when we look back, that's
Yes.
when it started.
Yes.
But maybe about a year of having vaccines available, when the first vaccine was available, a little less than a year, under emergency use authorization by the US FDA and other worldwide agencies. So with that context, I would say there are two things. One is continuing to abide by protocol that has been well vetted, well researched, and evidence-based in terms of support. CDC in the US and other global agencies, Ministry of Health here in the Turks and Caicos, all support, one, now that we have the vaccines,
Mhm.
getting vaccinated unless there's some mitigating circumstance, and even for those mitigating circumstances, for example, being immunocompromised, you can still be vaccinated. So,
Okay.
number one, get vaccinated.
Okay.
Number two, even if you're vaccinated, when you're vaccinated, and even for others if they choose not to be, continuing to observe protocol around social distancing, washing of hands, paying attention to sanitary and even being in contact to symptoms. And if you do exhibit symptoms, you quarantine, you isolate, and so on. So all of those protocols still make a lot of sense.
And wearing a mask.
And wearing a mask. For us, and in the context of this conversation, we're both vaccinated and we understand our situation. So with that background, you can do a little bit more. But I would continue to encourage all of us to be vigilant.
Yes.
And to think of others and to think of the community. So protocol is number one.
Mhm.
You could argue they're both equally important. The protocol and vaccination. And the protocol is all of those things you mentioned, from mask and social distancing to isolating if you have symptoms and so on.
Yeah.
Those still continue to be very important. The other angle I'd add to it, again, to, let's say, bring it back to a broader picture and remind us of where we're from.
Mhm.
Growing up, definitely in the Caribbean, as we did, and globally, vaccines are a part of public health.
Yeah.
And they're very important because of the research that was done before,
Yeah.
and understanding that we can curb devastating illnesses, polio, for example,
Yeah.
was essentially eliminated.
Mhm.
I think there have been pockets of
Because of the vaccine.
Because of the vaccine. So
Okay.
recognizing that vaccines have a place
Uh-huh.
and supporting that place and supporting that in our community from a public health standpoint
Mhm.
is very important. So I think that's an underlying platform to protocol
Mhm.
for COVID-19 and vaccination for COVID-19. The platform, remember from a public health standpoint, we all have a part to play.
Yes.
And I would say generally we're all here now benefiting from vaccines that
Yes.
many of our predecessors and our forefathers and foremothers brought to be.
Yes. I hear what you're saying, right? But there are many people who are aware of this,
Mhm.
that we took vaccines growing up as children.
Right.
But what they're saying, Dr. Cory, is that the vaccine for the COVID-19 was just manufactured
Mhm.
in less than 6 months. Is that true?
Yes and no. So for sure, the ultimate vaccines that were first in emergency use authorization approved by the FDA, I think the FDA was the first to approved both, but I think the UK actually approved the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine a little bit ahead of the US
Yes, I think they
in
did.
December last year.
Mhm.
Those are actually examples of, let's say, an nth generation of a vaccine that had predecessors that go back way before COVID-19 started.
Mhm.
So let me put it this way. Many of the drugs that we currently are, and vaccines that we currently are made available to have access to and that are quite beneficial, they're actually not the first one that came out of the lab, so to speak, in terms of being invented. Because, and I know this from my experience and in drug research, a molecule, let's say a small molecule or even a biologic, which is what a vaccine is, when you move from preclinical research to bring it into the clinic to test in humans, first for safety reasons, you have to make sure before you even think about is this going to work. Let's say it's a medicine for diabetes, and does it lower blood sugar, does it manage HbA1c and so on. The first thing, is it safe, right? Is it clear of toxic effects and therefore can be taken on to be exposed to more humans through the clinical trial phases. Phase 1, small, healthy, in healthy volunteers often planned for safety. Phase 2, a little bit larger, testing against endpoints to say, does this do what we expect it to do, like lowering blood sugar? Phase 3, much larger studies to say, okay, across a large population, it is not only demonstrating the efficacy point, but with statistical significance, right? Really robust. And that is the benchmark for doing clinical trials and bringing to market what we call a randomized clinical trial with lots more additives to it around being robust and rigorous.
Yes.
But the molecule that actually makes it is not necessarily the first one, right? They may have been like, let's say, an ancestry of the molecule before, right? So if you pick any small molecule for diabetes, for hypertension, that probably represents at least the fifth one, because there was maybe a toxic effect that was seen, so that version was killed, but the architecture, the backbone of the molecule is still good, and they make modifications to it.
Got it.
To have like the younger son
final part.
or the younger daughter or granddaughter and so on. So in the same way for the vaccines that, and there are mRNA vaccines, which is a new technology for Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna.
So it's new?
That technology is new.
Okay.
And I can speak a little bit about that. But to your first question, it's not as if they were already working on mRNA vaccines.
Long before the world heard about.
Indeed.
Okay.
And they were working on them for different other diseases. I believe for sure for Ebola again. They were pursuing mRNA as a platform to make vaccines, but they had not yet got to market. They were kind of still doing their research, still in development. It just so happens that with COVID-19 and all of the experience that they already had, let's say the collective clinical research and scientific research community, they could quickly pivot to COVID-19 because of all the learnings that they had, even though they had not yet had any of those released any of those.
I understand exactly.
So the learning is there.
Yeah. So there's already working on something, not necessarily for COVID.
Indeed.
But since COVID came out, based on their history and their experience, they was able to manipulate whatever to meet
exactly
the need to fight against COVID-19.
Exactly. And remember, as we spoke about before, the medical and scientific community already had a large body of knowledge with SARS in the early 2000s. So the technology was being worked on, even though not yet fully approved. The knowledge about the family of coronaviruses was already known, and SARS was already. So they could quickly bring these two together, focus attention on COVID. Of course, in the pandemic, high level of urgency. A lot of support was given from governments, regulatory agencies, including the US FDA, for example, to support moving quickly. And that meant people had to work long hours, and on both sides.
Because we were faced with a pandemic,
Indeed.
And we needed a solution.
Indeed.
So it's not something that being worked overnight, but this was a priority.
Indeed.
Gotcha.
And on both sides or on all sides, they put out all the stops to make it happen. So whereas in the past, and this goes to the speed element. Whereas in the past, let's say a drug company would be having multiple agents going through the pipeline at the same time. So if you have a finite number of people, they can only do so much to bring that full portfolio stepwise forward. If you say, well, this is super important, you actually need to pause those activities and focus only or primarily on COVID-19. And you're doing that as an industry with everyone kind of focused on that one major problem, but also from agencies and doctors in hospitals. Because so you could, if you bring all those factors together, what may seem as super quick in 1 year, maybe would have been the same if you were doing everything else as you would normally have done in 3 to 4 years.
Right.
So that's the other element.
Makes
One,
sense.
there's a lot of background that was done, so it wasn't brand new. It was, hey, we kind of know what this
Yes,
is.
you got the knowledge.
We got the knowledge. Let's put our best efforts, all resources, all hands on deck, so to speak, to try and solve the problem.
And we see so many people dying.
Indeed.
You know,
Indeed.
we can't allow this to happen.
Indeed.
So let's do this.
Indeed.
You know, so I hear what you're saying.
So there's a lot of background there, which again the public may not be fully aware of, and that's
Probably not.
understandable. Where prior knowledge, deep knowledge, but then the intensity to really make a change brought from all angles brought things to bear.
Yeah.
The other aspect that we should all be mindful of is, at least for the US FDA, the terminology that's called EUA, Emergency Use Authorization.
Okay, all right.
The US FDA approved the vaccines, all of them, and notably the 2 mRNA vaccines which came out first from Moderna and Pfizer, BioNTech, under EUA. So EUA is not a full approval. EUA says, given the context of the unmet need, the severity of the disease, and the data that were brought forward by the sponsors around efficacy and safety, we believe from a risk versus benefit perspective, the benefit of bringing this forward outweighs the risk.
Yes.
But we understand that there may be risks. For example, we don't have long-term data yet on these vaccines. So we're thinking back to December 2019. And through that calculus, should we approve or not? So there are lots of added dimensions that we should be aware of. They didn't say this is good to go and fully approved. They gave that, let's say, conditional approval. With the note of we need to continue to survey for continued evidence of safety and efficacy. And if we do see that, we can move to a full approval over time. And maybe to a broader population over time, which is what we saw. So first it was approved for adults. Then down to ages 12 and above. Then more recently, and not in all jurisdictions. So you see that stepwise, because in different populations and age groups, the risk versus benefit balance is different. As we remember in the early stage of the pandemic, as you can imagine, elderly and immunocompromised among us were the ones that were more severely affected. So we had to bring a response to that. So with all of those elements to it, EUA, benefit risk, and being stepwise, I would think it brings a different.
And it's not something that was approved overnight.
Exactly.
It was phased out.
Indeed.
Until they are confident that this truly, is the thing to defend against COVID-19.
Exactly. Exactly. And it wasn't brand new at all.
I'm glad to have you on the show because you bring a lot of value and understanding about this. So they developed this vaccine, and we took out 2 shots with the Pfizer. So why now do we have to have this booster shot? Why?
It's a good question. Again, we can draw on our experience from our childhood vaccines and vaccination programs. So at the heart of it, the vaccine is actually triggering the human body to do what it would normally do, but to do it faster and to do it hopefully in a more robust way targeted to this organism. So when you think to our childhood immunization programs, you may recall that, for example, rubella, even more, let's say, important as you become an adult and if you become exposed to, let's say, a cut in the yard and you get a tetanus booster. You had tetanus as an immunization as a kid.
Yes.
Right? So you could say, if you had it as a kid, you should be okay. But as it happens, and this is just human biology, the immune response that's mounted as a result of the vaccine. So the vaccine triggers the body to build antibodies, so that when you component to the immune system, it sees this antigen, which is let's say a signal on the organism, and it says, I saw you before, and actually I have antibodies against you. Let me just go back home, remind those guys, wake them up, produce more of them, and come and fight. That's essentially what the immune system is doing from an antibody and even T cell, which is another aspect of the immune system point of view.
Yeah.
They're bringing those with memory. However, over time, for some vaccines, that immunity wanes. So the ability to go home, wake up those antibodies that are there, have them get ready and produce more, that capability for some infections and some vaccines weakens over time.
I see. And then especially with the new variants coming out as well, is that part of the reason too? Because we now have new variants.
You do have new variants, but that's slightly a different topic from the waning immunity. Let me kind of touch the waning immunity and then we come to the variants.
Okay.
But it's a good point. So when you think about that phenomenon where it wanes, your body's immune system is a little bit weaker to respond, what scientific research has shown is that if you give a booster, so you give the same vaccine that you got sometime before, in the case of tetanus, around the time that you have the incident where you got a cut, give you the booster now, the memory is still there, but it just needs an added boost to not only expand the memory, but expand the machinery to act on the memory.
To fight against it.
And to bring those antibodies up again.
Okay.
There are others in the usual schedule of vaccination programs, I think, for example, MMR, that you get a booster almost as a matter of course, like an H12. So that's a matter of course. It's not in an incident like you get a cut.
Yeah.
It's a matter of course because it's known based on the research that giving it at that time actually protects you better later on in life.
So, okay, I hear what you're saying. For example, we took the vaccine pretty early.
Yes.
But say, because I don't know much about science, but I would imagine now that we're aware that these two vaccines are not good enough, so to speak. So when they manufactured a new set of vaccines, wouldn't the new set of vaccines be manufactured such a way that they would need a booster?
It's a good question. That's a really good question. And I do believe some researchers and some sponsors are looking into that. I think the jury is still out on some of the other vaccines in terms of whether they need a booster or not. I know so far I've heard that Pfizer, Moderna, and I think Johnson & Johnson all suggest that boosters will be helpful.
And they're the main ones anyway, right?
They're the main ones anyway. But you have maybe tens of other vaccines in development around the world.
That is true.
It depends on the science. It depends on the science around what actually is in that backbone of the virus, of the vaccine, so to speak, whether it's mRNA or viral vector vaccine and so on. It depends. And also
what is mRNA for people watching? What is mRNA?
So DNA is the template by which organisms and humans are made, right? So in our cells and in the nucleus of our cells, there's a template. It's almost like a code, if you think about computers, for life, right? And I won't go into too much of the detail. However, that code it's a long list of A's, C's, T's, and G's in different combinations. It's a long polymer. That within the nucleus, there are different agents that read that code and says, okay, for this part of the code, you're actually coding for a particular protein. Let's say an insulin for diabetics. I speak to diabetics because many of us are familiar with diabetes and our family members. Insulin is the protein that our body produces to ensure that your blood sugar remains normal. Broadly speaking.
Yes.
Insulin is a protein. But that protein actually is made from that code, which is DNA. But to create the code, the body is fascinating. The machinery reads it and makes a replica of that DNA That's called RNA.
Okay.
And there's a long, I won't give it the full biological name, but for those who are interested, you can realize those are very similar type of molecules going from D to R.
Okay.
The R, again, is read to translate it to a protein, right? And a protein is a polymer with different amino acids. So it's reading from the template, and based on the template, like the computer code, okay, this is the application that you need, the RNA. And for that application, okay, how do I use Microsoft Word in the context of this meeting? That's translated into the protein, right?
Okay.
mRNA, however, is very short-lived. So the DNA is in your body all the time.
Yeah.
But proteins are made, depending on which protein it is, sometimes on a continuous basis for some proteins, on demand, based on a particular function. And to support those two ends of the spectrum, RNA by definition is short-lived because it's only there to translate that code from DNA into protein. After it does the translation, the RNA decays and goes away.
Okay.
So coming back to vaccines, previous eras of vaccine development used, because essentially what you're trying to do with a vaccine is to trigger your immune response and system to see an agent that's foreign, bacteria, the virus, and prepare antibodies against it. So researchers, decades ago realized if I actually introduce the virus itself, but not in its fullest, most virulent, most infectious form, what's called an attenuated vaccine. So you actually dull, let's say, how sharp the virus can cause infection. And they do it in various ways. Sometimes they use only a piece, a portion of the virus to trigger the response. That was kind of the first era of vaccine development. But then more recently with mRNA, because with that approach, you can have untoward effects because it's still a virus.
Yeah.
Right? So you could have some unwanted effects from still having some viral particles as part of the vaccine. Also, in development, it's not as efficient to build vaccine doses using some of the viral vector platforms compared to RNA. So come back to RNA. So remember, RNA is part of that messaging, coding from DNA to protein. So what researchers decided in the context of COVID, but again, it was happening even before, they said, well, rather than introduce a virus, why don't we introduce the RNA that will, in the cell, once injected into the human, create the protein, the particular protein that we want to raise the antibody against. That protein in COVID is a spike protein, for example. Rather than give the virus, which could cause unwanted effects, let's just give the RNA to then code for that specific protein, and the body will respond all of its immune system machinery to that protein in a very targeted way, in a very sharp way. And it won't have wasted effort trying to raise antibodies against other parts of the virus that may not be as important as that one specific protein in the context of COVID spike. The other beauty of it is the RNA, by definition, is short-lived. It goes away. So that was the thinking, and that's what they moved to. So they found mRNA vaccines, at least from a vaccine development standpoint, to be very efficient, both in bringing the response, the antibody response, and the immune response, but even in terms of the scaling up. So I know I've gone into a lot of detail, but
no, this is very informative. This is very informative. So there are people who also state, because there's a lot of myths out there.
Indeed.
And I really wanted the show to try and make people think independently rather than think of these myths. There are a lot of people that believe that this vaccine has a chip in it.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that for me?
That one is a tough one for me to elaborate on.
But there's no chip.
Indeed. Vaccines in general, it's so much of a different way of thinking.
I mean, when I say elaborate, I mean, are there chips in these vaccines?
No. There are no chips in any vaccines.
And no vaccines?
Yeah. And it's probably very hard to understand how you could have a chip in a vaccine. Again, vaccines are biological material. whether it be an attenuated virus, as I spoke about before, an mRNA, as we were seeing with the two COVID vaccines, two front runners, or proteins. There are proteins as well that are used as vaccines to trigger the response. These are all human molecules. So going back to the chemistry, chips are inorganic, generally. Mm-hmm. So all of what I spoke about humans are organic.
Got it.
Right? You're made up of proteins and carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. The building blocks from an organic chemistry standpoint of life.
Mm-hmm. It's almost opposite.
Almost opposite. As far as I know, chips, these are synthetic.
Yeah.
You know, usually electromagnetic.
Yeah.
And oftentimes have a different scale in terms of size compared to vaccines.
Yeah.
So to me, I can't put it together.
Yeah. Got it. Good. I like it. Good. Now, persons with this COVID-19, people believe that once you have the vaccine, you will not get COVID-19. And we know that's not true.
Indeed.
Do you think that was the message that was going on there? Because, I don't know, people believe that once, if you take the vaccine, you're not going to get COVID-19. And so when people hear that individuals who are vaccinated got COVID-19, they say, what's the point of taking the vaccine if I'm not going to get COVID? If I'm going to get COVID?
Right. It's a really good point, and it's unfortunate because sometimes there is what's called unconscious bias or confirmation bias, where if you have a particular point of view and you are less willing to take all data, take other points of view and bring them and distill them for the full takeaway. If you're not of that mind, you tend to pick the parts of the data set
that is true,
that confirm your original point of view.
That is true.
So that's confirmation bias.
Yeah.
So you know, as humans, we need to constantly push ourselves to be open-minded, to look at all the data, all the points of view, but let the data also lead you to the best answer. So to your point, and to your question, across all of the bodies of knowledge around these vaccines, even when you look back to childhood vaccines, we know, and scientific research shows, that none of them are 100% efficacious.
That's it.
And by that, you understand that there is a risk, albeit very small, that some of the persons who received a vaccine against a particular disease may not have protection. And to be honest, some of the other phenomena that we spoke about earlier, waning immunity, for example, even though they had immunity before, when we speak about some folks who may be immunocompromised, or maybe they have a genetic background that doesn't allow them to bring the right response, you may have usually in the context of COVID and generally for childhood vaccine programs, you may have a very small minority that don't.
Right, because nothing is 100%.
Nothing is 100%.
Perfect.
So that's number one. I would say, number two, when the first two, again, the front runners mRNA came out, and even Johnson & Johnson and others, they come with very high efficacy rates, 90+% for the most. But again, you may still have a minority that don't benefit.
Yeah, because it's not 100% efficacy, so there'll be
Exactly. What has been shown through the research in the context of COVID is, even for those who are vaccinated and for all intents and purposes have mounted a response, but maybe it's not for those now. There's a small subset who may become infected and have an overt infection, so they may manifest symptoms. Because they may, remember, there are also those of us who haven't been vaccinated, may quote unquote be infected, we may have, but we show no symptoms. It's what we call subclinical. But there may be a small proportion who do exhibit some symptoms. But oftentimes, again, research has shown, those cases tend to be milder, self-limited, and of a shorter duration than if one were not vaccinated.
Got it.
To that gain, that shows there is some protection.
Yes. Yes.
So again, the totality of the data and looking across the board, I would believe most of us, all of us, should recognize that risk versus benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Benefit outweighs the risk.
Yeah.
And this notion that it's not protected is unfounded.
Yeah.
And the flip side is, why would you risk or take that risk on in the context of the totality of the data, given what?
Yeah, exactly. You know, I was watching a video the other day. It was interviewing this doctor in Jamaica,
Mm-hmm.
and they were talking about his experiences in dealing with persons who, you know, contracted COVID-19. He said it led to so many other issues.
Yes.
It led to kidney failure. It led to can you elaborate on that for us? I mean, how this COVID-19 is
Yes.
also leading to other issues?
Yes.
And that's why I think it's important people be able to protect themselves.
That's a very important topic and a
Yeah.
very important question. Oftentimes when we think of COVID-19, perhaps when we look at the name of the coronavirus, it has a respiratory in it.
Yes.
And the predominant symptoms and symptomatology, especially in the beginning, of course, is around the lung. Difficulty breathing, maybe cough, whether it's upper respiratory or lower respiratory. But that, in some cases, is only the beginning. The devastating effects of COVID-19 oftentimes are from a multi-system disorder on the backbone of a very overactivated and misdirected immune and inflammatory response. So let me say a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
Remember we spoke about immune response, and as with most things in our body and in biology, it's always a balance. You know, there's what we call homeostasis. You know, as our life and as an organism, it's all about keeping things in check.
Yes.
You know, you have a positive and you have oftentimes another pathway that keeps that pathway in check.
Okay.
The immune system is very much like that. So you get the initial trigger, the body mounts a response, but the body knows that for various reasons, sometimes genetic background, sometimes exposure to more of the antigen, the body can go into overdrive and continue to produce antibodies. And it's not only the antibodies, but there's a whole host of other factors that are elevated and trigger. That's why when you have an infection, you feel fever and you feel aches and you feel pain. It's because the immune system is doing so much. You know, there are molecules, like there's one called TNF, for example. When they push out, again, they're trying to fight infection, but sometimes it's just so much happening. It's like mass and everyone is there, and it actually spills over to other organs that weren't really in question to begin with.
Yeah.
That happens in COVID-19 for the severe cases, and they have multi-system disorders. The blood system, cardiovascular system, renal, which is kidneys, and that ongoing inflammation and ongoing immune response out of check, uncontrolled, can lead to severe, and oftentimes, sadly enough, those who have succumbed and died from COVID-19, it's not only a respiratory disease, it's not only the lungs, it's widespread, and it's severe.
Wow.
It's severe. Blood clots, bleeding, diabetes, kidney damage, as we spoke about before, a whole host of multi-system disorders. COVID-19 has really brought, for the scientific and clinical research community, a lot of understanding around the immune system, but also...
Which is very complex, right?
Very complex, very complex. But also a realization that you do have diseases, and COVID is not the only. There are other multi-system disorders, sometimes from infection, but this one happened so suddenly, so severely, and across so much of our population, worldwide. But you're right, you cannot multi-system disorders.
Well, Dr. Cory, just want to thank you for this opportunity to be on the show. I don't know if there's anything else that you think we didn't cover before we end the show. Anything else?
I think we covered quite a broad range.
We did. Well, Thank you again. And for
Thank
those
you.
who are watching, thank you for watching my show, the Drexel Show. And I want you to rise up and take your position. I know there are many people out there who have their own stories about COVID-19, who have their own stories about the vaccine, and sometimes you're being influenced by so many things that are unfunded. And so that's why I invited Dr. Cory Williams, who is a researcher, who he's not a Johnny-come-lately. He's not. He's been around for years as a medical researcher. You know, he knows what he's talking. And after listening to him, you know, I hope you are convinced with the information that he has provided to us, and you make that decision on what you want to do with your life, because this COVID-19 is so real, it can impact you for the rest of your life. Not just with this breathing issues, but many other issues. I can't tell you what to do, but you do have a choice. There is a vaccine available that you can take. The vaccine is not something that was manufactured overnight. It's been going on for quite some time. It's just so happened when COVID came out, you know, that became a priority. And that is why we have the vaccines we have now today. So I do hope that, you know, this show was very informative to you, and that now you can make a decision based on what was provided to you. Thank you for watching.